Today we're at the Penobscot Experimental Forest in central Maine, and here we're in the southern part of what is called the Acadian Forest region, and this is a transitional zone between the eastern broadleaf and boreal forests. So as we take a look at the species composition, and this particular area has not had any management since the late 1800s, and so we're really seeing the natural stand dynamics and the species composition that would normally occur on this site. Prior to that time, this particular forest was owned by forest industry, and so it had been repeatedly partially cut. So we were starting with a stand that was primarily a grading second growth with scattered residual older trees and not many bigger than the small saw timber. So as we look around today, we see that this is a fairly poorly drained site that is representative of the forest that we're on. And so this is conifer dominated. And here we're dealing with the shade tolerant conifers. We call those the northern conifers. And that includes eastern hemlock. We see an example right here, which is our longest lived dominant conifer here. Very shade tolerant and slow growing. We also see red spruce. Here, a nice one in the overstory. Again, a very shade tolerant conifer, long lived and slow growing. Both of those species are really favored by a moisture holding substrate for regeneration, and so you'll find them where there's disturbed mineral soil, where there's an abundance of highly decayed deadwood. Now, another conifer species that is quite dominant here as well is balsam fir. Now, balsam fir is slightly different from these others in that it is very fast growing and competitive relatively when it is young. It seeds more prolifically, more often, and has larger seeds, and so doesn't have the narrow regeneration requirements that its companion species have. It tends to be short-lived on these poor sites. It will get to about 60 to 80 years and then is subject to rot. So we call that its pathological longevity. So in a stand like this where we haven't had any management in over 100 years, you won't see very many balsam fir. Another important conifer we see on these lowland sites is northern white cedar. And in fact, I had a nice example over here, but we see it has recently broken and fallen down. Northern white cedar is another very long-lived, shade-tolerant conifer that requires a moisture-holding substrate and grows slowly relative to its competitors. So the general theme with our dominant conifers is that they have specific requirements for establishment and early growth, and we have to be thoughtful about their relative growth rates with regard to companion species. In addition to the conifers, we have hardwoods in this forest type, and on these poorly drained sites they tend to be red maple, which of course is able to sprout after harvesting, so is quite competitive in managed stands, paper birch, and a number of aspen species. As site quality improves, you will pick up some yellow birch, white ash, and sugar maple. But on the sites that we're looking at today, those aren't going to be important components of the stand. Managing the hardwoods and softwoods in mixture can be challenging, not only because of the competitive advantage that the hardwoods have, but because a buildup of hardwood leaf litter on the forest floor can make it difficult for the conifers to establish. So when we look at this stand where we've had no management for quite some time, we see good examples of the natural disturbance regime. So here, that is predominantly small scale disturbances created by death of one or a few trees, resulting in a small canopy gap. And we see here behind me an example of that. When I started here over 20 years ago, there was no gap here. But now that we see a number of trees have broken and we're starting to open the canopy, sometimes this does become an opportunity for the less shade tolerant species to establish, but often it is releasing shade tolerant regeneration of the conifers already in the understory. And that's what we see here. We see eastern hemlock that was already existing on the site. We will get some larger gaps, and over here on my right we see one where I recall that there were some paper birch. Those are not as long-lived as our conifer species, and so as those died, we're now having an opening for release or establishment of new trees. Here we see where there have been some additional mortality of individual stems around the initial gap, so there's sort of a contagion where the gap extends over time. We can have a situation such as that here on my left, where after an opening has been created, the trees will grow up and create a dense stand representative of the stem exclusion phase of stand development, where you have little to no understory regeneration. When we look at the understory of this stand, we see not only a preponderance of here eastern hemlock, the most shade tolerant of our conifers, but a buildup of deadwood and a pit and mound microtopography. And this is characteristic of these stands that haven't been very managed. One of the things I will mention is that there is potential for larger scale disturbances associated with the native eastern spruce budworm, which has about a 40-year period in which populations will increase and cause defoliation and mortality of primarily balsam fir, but also red spruce. And we do sometimes have hurricanes that will cause a greater degree of stand disturbance. However, a true stand replacing disturbance, such as that resulting from fire, has a return interval in this region for these lowland forest types of over 1,000 years at the stand level. So as we go through the forest today and look at the outcomes of different types of management, I think it's important that we keep in mind the structure, the species composition, the characteristics of the forest floor and the deadwood that we're observing here in the absence of management for more than 100 years, so that we can understand how the silvicultural treatments that we applied changed the condition of the forest. So at our first stop, when we talked about the natural dynamics and the dominant species composition in the absence of management, we focused on the shade-tolerant conifers and the requirements they have for establishment and early growth. Here we're at a site that has been heavily harvested 2 times, and we call this a commercial clear cut. I know that terminology is used differently in different places, so I want to define what that term means to us. So as we look at the different treatments today, you'll know what I'm talking about. So when we say commercial clear cut, we are referring to a harvest in which all merchantable trees were removed without any attention to regeneration or tending. So this is regarded from a silvicultural perspective not to be a sustainable approach to management. This would be more of a focus on extraction, and unfortunately is representative of harvesting that's happened in a lot of places and forest conditions that you might encounter and need to find a management solution for. We like to show this here because it demonstrates quite well the differences in species composition that can result from paying attention to establishing and releasing the regeneration or not doing so. So here we came in the 1950s. They harvested everything that was commercial at that time. When the volume grew back in the 1980s, we did that again. Now by the 1980s, the merchantability standards had changed. So this was a much heavier harvest at that time. And what we see today is that in the absence of well-established advanced regeneration of the shade-tolerant species, a preponderance of the shade-intolerant and sprouting hardwoods. So this stand was 80% softwoods when we started this experiment. And today, this is what we call an HS or hardwood dominated mixed wood stand. And so what we see here is paper birch, gray birch, pin cherry. In some portions of the stand, we have quaking and a little bit of big tooth aspen, and about 25% of the basal area in sprout origin red maple. And this is a species that has become much more common, not just here in the stands that we've cut heavily, but across this entire forest type. So we've seen over the last century a shift so that red maple and balsam fir are now the top two most abundant species. And that represents a challenge for management. When we look at the conifers here, red spruce has almost been completely eliminated from the stand. We do have some eastern hemlock that has persisted from scattered residuals that were left and in an understory position, but mostly we see balsam fir. I mentioned previously that balsam fir is much more competitive and establishes more easily, grows more rapidly than the other conifer species that we have. We do not regard balsam fir as a priority species which we are trying to perpetuate in large quantities, both because it wasn't historically as prevalent as it is now, the short pathological longevity, and the spruce budworm concerns. And so here, through the lack of paying attention to species composition during the regeneration period, we have shifted stand composition and structure towards one that is more early successional, short-lived, and more prone to native insects and other forms of decay. I will just point out a couple additional things before we're going to move on to a next stand. I want to show you an interesting transition. I mentioned the sprouting red maple. Where you have red maple sprouts, we tend to identify two different conditions or categories. And one is trees that have originated, such as over here, some of these on my left, high on the stump, multiple stems, prone to decay and poor form. So those take up a lot of room in the stand and are not necessarily going to be desirable from a commodity production perspective. On the other hand, we sometimes will have red maple stump sprouts, such as the one over here, where we see the stems have originated lower on the stump, so are less prone to decay and have better form and a tighter arrangement. In a stand where you have red maple that have originated this way, those of the lower position of the better form have more potential and could be thinned in the future if you wanted to maintain those in the stand. The other thing I'll just mention is here we see an abundance of hardwood leaf litter, which I mentioned is a challenge when you're trying to maintain softwood composition on these fairly lowland sites. We see very little large decayed deadwood here because of the past management that has been done. So we have very small decaying wood, and we don't have the pit and mound microtopography that we observed on the other stand. So these are some characteristics of the stand that differ from the natural condition and present challenges in management that I will address a little bit later as we view the different stops on the forest. So what I'd like to do now is we're going to walk across the stand boundary to a place where we applied a shelterwood. And there we had 3 different harvests for the purpose of establishing and then releasing those softwoods that I've been talking about. So let's take a look at that. This stand is the one that I said was regenerated with a regular or uniform 3-stage shelterwood. So this means that we made 3 stand entries during a period of less than 20 years. So the first one was a preparatory cut in which we came in and we removed about 25% of the basal area in the stand and took out mostly the trees that we didn't want to perpetuate in the future stand. We then came back about 10 years later, and we took out about half of the remaining stand that was here at that time. That was the establishment cut, made for the purpose of establishing regeneration of the species that we wanted to perpetuate, which were primarily red spruce, and on this site, some eastern white pine. We're on a slightly better site than we were previously. The final overstory removal, which was complete, occurred about 5 to 7 years after that, and at that time they removed all trees in the stand that were larger than sapling size. As a result of that gradual removal of the overstory, we established a very dense stand of the shade tolerant regeneration. And so today we see there are very few hardwoods in this stand, and we have balsam fir, red spruce, hemlock, and eastern white pine. This stand has not had any management since that time. It can be important to consider pre-commercial or early stand tending, and we will look at an example of that. Here, in the absence of that, this stand is in the stem exclusion phase of development. No understory vegetation or small regeneration at all. It is going through the process of self-thinning, so we are seeing mortality of trees in the sapling and small pole sizes, and differentiation of the trees into different crown classes and canopy strata. At this time, this stand does present a management challenge because it is so dense. The trees have an unstable height diameter ratio, and so thinning at this time would be challenging. It also is somewhat of a concern because of the small live crown ratios on these trees. If we had a spruce budworm outbreak, the trees would not be particularly vigorous. There are some advantages to growing a very dense conifer stand like this one. The first is that over time, the natural mortality of the balsam fir, which was originally more abundant than the spruce in this stand, has been greater, so that we see fir dropping out at a faster rate. So we're slowly transitioning to a more spruce dominated stand. In addition, I mentioned that we have eastern white pine in this stand. So as we look at the pine trees, and here's one behind me, and you see them scattered throughout. In this region, they are susceptible to the white pine weevil. That will kill the leader of the tree, and one of the lateral branches will take over. In stands that are more open, these trees can develop very poor form and a bush-like structure with little commodity value. Here, where our eastern white pine are growing so densely in a stratified layer above the spruce and fir, even if they were weevilled, the lateral had to go up in order to reach the light, and so the trees have maintained relatively good form over time. That is one of the things that we have to think about in management of eastern white pine in these young, even-age stands. We generally would not recommend a thinning until the trees are at least 1 log length tall in order to maintain their form. So earlier we looked at an example of a uniform shelterwood that had been regenerated with a 3-stage overstory removal. This particular stand had a 2-stage overstory removal, but that wasn't the most important difference. The most important difference was that the final overstory removal was incomplete. So at that time they left, this would have been in the 1960s, all trees smaller than 6 inches, which included many fir, as well as trees larger than that size that the loggers didn't want at that time, and that included a number of hardwoods. This is a good example of why it's important to think about the quality and composition of the trees that you choose to retain in an irregular shelterwood stand. So here we had a 2-age stand where the older residuals were primarily fir and short-lived hardwoods. What that means is that when you compare this stand to the one that had the complete overstory removal, we had more volume over here for a number of decades. However, we then entered a period of time, I would say about 40 years after that final harvest, where we started to have mortality of our retention trees. So we saw the volume of the stand where we had done a complete overstory removal actually catch up to and overtake this one. There is a lot of interest in maintaining reserves in stands after you have applied a Shelterwood cut, but here we felt that we were losing too many of those and needed to come in and do a commercial thinning. Unfortunately, the new cohort was still just barely merchantable, so for that age class it was an early commercial thinning. We see the result of that here. This was a 40% removal, which is the maximum that has been recommended for these softwood dominated stands in order to avoid problems with wind throw. And what happened is we decided that we wanted to retain as many of those residuals as we could for the sake of maintaining structural diversity and perpetuating a stand composition that was diverse. Taking out the poor quality residuals and the ones that we thought were going to die and thinning the new cohort resulted in the stand condition which you see today, which has good species diversity, has an interesting structure, and has some red spruce and white pine in it. Unfortunately, what we also saw is a very high proportion of stand area and trails. This was a cut to length operation with a dangle head processor and a forwarder. The machinery was quite large with an insufficient reach the way our trails were initially laid out. They were moved closer together and the stand ended up with 30% area and trails. So thinking about the size of wood that you're harvesting and the equipment that you're using is important if possible. In addition, because our new cohort was still in a very early commercial thinning stage and had not had a previous pre-commercial thinning, after the harvest we saw a fair amount of breakage of the stems in the younger size class. So this stand still has potential, but I think if we had been more thoughtful about the reserves that we kept back in 1960 and retained species of better quality or with greater longevity, that we would be in a better position today. So when we look at the uniform Shelterwood, and the one that we started with had the 3-stage overstory removal with complete removal of the overwood in a very even age stand with no subsequent pre-commercial or commercial thinning, we saw that we had very small live crowns and unstable height diameter ratio. In addition, even though the stand had started to be managed in the 1950s with complete overstory removal by close to 1970, in 2020, the majority of the trees still were not big enough for commercial thinning. Pre-commercial thinning is a really important tool in this forest type when managing even age stands, either regenerated from Shelterwood or from a clear cut, which we'll look at a little bit later. The stand that we're in right now was originally part of the stand that we looked at earlier that had no pre-commercial thinning. This one, however, was pre-commercially thinned in the early 1980s to a spacing of 2 by 3 meters. More typical spacing in this forest type is 6 by 6 or 8 by 8 feet. What we notice here, compared to the other stand that we were in, is fewer stems, diameter is much larger, and the live crown ratio is much longer. Often when we talk about thinning, and particularly pre-commercial thinning, we think of the saying, bigger, better, faster. And those aren't the only benefits in this forest type. As I mentioned, balsam fir, much more competitive and abundant in these mixed stands of spruce fir and hemlock, and yet isn't our most preferred species. By doing a pre-commercial thinning, we have the opportunity to adjust species composition to favor the spruce. And in fact, in this particular stand, we would release a spruce and cut down the fir as long as the spruce was half as tall as the fir. So a deliberate effort was made. And what we see now is that of all the treatments that I'm showing you here at the forest today, the Shelterwood with pre-commercial thinning had the greatest increase in red spruce, which was our primary objective when we started this entire suite of experiments. So by doing the gradual removal of the overstory in a period of 15 to less than 20 years, favoring the red spruce in our early preparatory and establishment cuts, and then coming in 20 years, give or take, after that final overstory removal, and doing a spacing that favored the spruce over the fir, we made meaningful shifts in species composition that are beneficial for this stand in a number of ways. First, the spruce has greater longevity and greater product potential, and when you think of the spruce budworm, although it's named after the spruce, the fir is its preferred host. And so there are a lot of benefits to doing the pre-commercial thinning here, and it has put us in a position now where we were able already to come into parts of this stand and do commercial thinning where we aren't ready to do that in the portion of the stand that was unthinned. And so this is a tool that is worth considering and can be a valuable investment in a young stand dominated by northern conifers. Now we'll move into a portion of the same stand that was not only pre-commercially thinned, but commercially thinned as well. So you'll notice as we move over here that there's a change in the stand structure and the canopy openness. This portion of the stand was commercially thinned a few years ago. This is part of an experiment that's being done by the University of Maine. They have a statewide study that's called the Commercial Thinning Research Network. They've gone into some stands that have been pre-commercially thinned before and looked at different densities and timings of commercial thinning. The research that we've been doing here, which looked at pre-commercial thinning in Shelterwoods, provided a place where they could study some of that. So we see in this area that they came in and they did a commercial thinning. They tried where possible to remove the fir, retaining the spruce as the longer-lived species. In some places, we still do have fir as residuals because there weren't enough spruce in that particular part of the stand. Pre-commercial thinning was done here in the early 1980s, and they started doing commercial thinning at 5-year intervals in different parts of the stand for their study in the early 2000s through the 2000 teens. So that means that the commercial thinning was done about 30 years after the pre-commercial thinning. What we now see today is a change in the stand composition, continuing to move it towards spruce, which has the greater product potential and longer lives. We also see that there has been a regeneration response. Per the textbook, thinning is not intended to regenerate a stand. However, with these highly shade-tolerant species, you will have release of established advanced regeneration or initiation of a new cohort. This can be beneficial because it can set up a stand to be well suited for Shelterwood regeneration in the future because you already have some regeneration established. So in this particular stand, they have some sprouting red maple, which may need to be treated with herbicides in the future to prevent it from becoming dominant in some parts of the stand. Red spruce, which is considered a 2-rotation species relative to the fir, it can easily live twice as long. And the intention will to be come back here and do either another commercial thinning, depending on the amount of spruce, or initiate a Shelterwood sequence. This is a really nice example of the benefits of pre-commercial and commercial thinning in this forest type. The first stand we looked at that didn't have those treatments was still dominated by submerchantable trees, most of which were fir. Here, where we've been able to accelerate the growth of the trees and make adjustments to species composition through selecting which crop trees to release, we now have a stand with a much greater proportion of spruce, therefore better set up both for production potential and for conversion to another more complicated stand structure in the future if you chose to do that with an irregular Shelterwood or multi-age treatment. Our pre-commercial thinning was essentially crop tree approach. So what that means is that we found the most desirable hardwood or softwood species on a spacing of about 10 to 20 feet, and we did a crown touching release. That meant that we removed any trees that were touching on at least 3 sides of the tree, as well as trees that were overtopping the tree that we wanted to release. One thing that's important to consider is in these mixed stands where we have hardwoods and softwoods together, and the hardwoods are faster growing, they are stratified above the softwoods. And so when we were releasing the softwoods, we had to take trees both above and around them. When we were releasing the hardwoods, we were primarily taking trees that were competing on the sides, but if there was a softwood tree below our released hardwood, we did not harvest it. And that is because here it's light that is the limiting factor, it's not moisture. So having softwood trees in a sub-canopy position around our desired hardwoods was not a problem for us. So the hardwoods that we released included low origin, good form red maple stump sprouts. And there we did not thin within the clumps, we just released the whole clump. We also released some paper birch and aspen species. This was accomplished both mechanically and chemically. For instance, we did use, where we were removing whole red maple sprout clumps, basal spray of herbicide. We did otherwise brush saw or even some chainsaw work for some of the larger poor quality residuals that we wanted to remove. What we found when we looked at the response of these trees over 10 years is that we had excellent increase in growth of the trees that we had released, both the softwoods and the hardwoods, with the exception of those red maple sprout clumps. Now, I think that is because they are primarily competing with each other within the clump, and because we had not thinned them down to 1 or 2 stems but left the entire clumps intact, I think that wasn't as successful as we hoped it would be. And in hindsight, I think I would further thin within those clumps. One thing that we were concerned about was epicormic branches on the hardwoods that we released. And the species here where that would be relevant is paper birch. We came out in collaboration with a university cooperator and we looked at the presence of epicormics and the height to those within the 10 years after release. And what we found is that relative to a control where we had not done any rehabilitation treatment, we did have more epicormic branches and lower on the stem of the trees that had been released. However, none of those occurred below the height of the first log. And this, when we thought about it, seemed related to the fact that we had kept softwoods in a sub-canopy position with those hardwoods. So in mixed wood stands, if you have slower growing softwoods around desirable hardwood trees, those can have a training effect and help to shade the lower bole and prevent epicormics from sprouting on what would be the most valuable log in the tree. So that was one important lesson that we learned from this. In addition, I mentioned that we had done different approaches to rehabilitation. One was just our pre-commercial thinning or crop tree release. Another included timber stand improvement, so getting rid of all of the non-commercial species and unacceptable growing stock in the stand. And that required an additional investment because all of this is before you can merchandise the wood. In our more intensive treatment, we also did enrichment planting of the red spruce because there weren't any red spruce seeds or larger trees here to perpetuate that species. Again, that added expense to the treatment. We did not find that approach to be as successful for two reasons. The first is when we modeled the future value of the stand, we found that on these sites, which are not very high quality, so we're not dealing with yellow birch or sugar maple or white ash, our best hardwoods are paper birch, and we have a lot of fir here. So these don't have very high value in the future, and we could not recoup the investment we made in the more expensive treatment. In addition, the red spruce that we had planted, even though we put small cages around them to protect them, those cages had been subject to frost heave in the winter, and we had small rodents get under there and chew a lot of those right off. We had almost complete browsing of them and very high mortality over the 3 years that followed. So if you are doing an enrichment planting like that, it is important to think about protecting those seedlings and doing it in a way that is secure. Here it was hare that were our primary browsers, so that might not be a concern on other sites. So reflecting back on the findings from this rehabilitation study, we concluded that the crop tree release was effective and would recommend that for stands of this type. Doing additional work, the timber stand improvement and the planting represents a greater investment, and it wasn't as successful. However, there are steps that could have been taken to improve the planting success, and if you are willing to make the investment at this time to improve the stand without necessarily feeling that you had to fully recoup that from harvests in the future, it might be warranted to do the additional improvement. The last point that I'll make about this is that stands that have been indiscriminately harvested in the past tend to have a somewhat patchy composition and structure. So whether you're applying a rehabilitation treatment either in a pre-commercial or commercial context, it's important to think about having some variability in your prescription. And this can be accomplished with what we call a multiple treatment approach, where you would identify 2 to 3 conditions in the stand that are representative and have a different treatment for those. So one might be that you would do some thinning, and another might be that you would do some overstory removal. That information can then be used to inform marking of the stand or the work of the operator if the timber isn't marked. So when we look at the uniform Shelterwood, and the one that we started with had the 3-stage overstory removal with complete removal of the overwood in a very even age stand with no subsequent pre-commercial or commercial thinning, we saw that we had very small live crowns and unstable height diameter ratio. In addition, even though the stand had started to be managed in the 1950s with complete overstory removal by close to 1970, in 2020, the majority of the trees still were not big enough for commercial thinning. Pre-commercial thinning is a really important tool in this forest type when managing even age stands, either regenerated from Shelterwood or from a clear cut, which we'll look at a little bit later. The stand that we're in right now was originally part of the stand that we looked at earlier that had no pre-commercial thinning. This one, however, was pre-commercially thinned in the early 1980s to a spacing of 2 by 3 meters. More typical spacing in this forest type is 6 by 6 or 8 by 8 feet. What we notice here, compared to the other stand that we were in, is fewer stems, diameter is much larger, and the live crown ratio is much longer. Often when we talk about thinning, and particularly pre-commercial thinning, we think of the saying, bigger, better, faster. And those aren't the only benefits in this forest type. As I mentioned, balsam fir, much more competitive and abundant in these mixed stands of spruce fir and hemlock, and yet isn't our most preferred species. By doing a pre-commercial thinning, we have the opportunity to adjust species composition to favor the spruce. And in fact, in this particular stand, we would release a spruce and cut down the fir as long as the spruce was half as tall as the fir. So a deliberate effort was made. And what we see now is that of all the treatments that I'm showing you here at the forest today, the Shelterwood with pre-commercial thinning had the greatest increase in red spruce, which was our primary objective when we started this entire suite of experiments. So by doing the gradual removal of the overstory in a period of 15 to less than 20 years, favoring the red spruce in our early preparatory and establishment cuts, and then coming in 20 years, give or take, after that final overstory removal, and doing a spacing that favored the spruce over the fir, we made meaningful shifts in species composition that are beneficial for this stand in a number of ways. First, the spruce has greater longevity and greater product potential, and when you think of the spruce budworm, although it's named after the spruce, the fir is its preferred host. And so there were a lot of benefits to doing the pre-commercial thinning here, and it has put us in a position now where we were able already to come into parts of this stand and do commercial thinning, where we aren't ready to do that in the portion of the stand that was unthinned. And so this is a tool that is worth considering and can be a valuable investment in a young stand dominated by northern conifers. So earlier we looked at a stand where there had been 2 very heavy, what I would call indiscriminate harvests. So that's what we call the commercial clear cut. And the stand that we're in right now is actually part of that same management unit. There are a number of stands on the landscape here in the Acadian forest and elsewhere that have been subjected to heavy partial harvesting like that. When that happens, the management opportunities can be few. So one of the approaches is to consider a rehabilitation treatment. Ideally, there would be sufficient wood, commercial, in the stand to do something that looks like a combined commercial thinning and timber stand improvement, or perhaps an irregular shelterwood. If, however, the stand is still primarily submerchantable, you can consider pre-commercial rehabilitation treatments. And when I say rehabilitation, I'm talking about restoring the production potential to a stand. So this is somewhat different from restoration, which would be trying to create conditions that are informed by a past ecological condition. There are elements of restoration in rehabilitation, but they have a somewhat different objective. So this stand had been last harvested quite heavily in the 1980s with some scattered residuals and a new component of balsam fir and shade intolerant hardwoods. We came in here in the early 2000s to try some different pre-commercial approaches to improving the stand. Our objective was to remove non-commercial species where possible, remove the poor quality, unacceptable growing stock or cull trees, and to create growing space around the best of the new cohort, admittedly mostly hardwoods, with the idea that we would improve their growth for a future commercial thinning. We approach these treatments using both mechanical and chemical means to accomplish pre-commercial thinning. So we did do some basal spray of herbicides on, for instance, the red maple sprout clumps that were of poor quality and form to prevent them from resprouting. We also did some mechanical work, and that did include a small amount of chainsaw work for some of the stems that were too big for brush saws. In addition to what we called crop tree release, so that was coming in and at intervals of about 10 to 20 feet, finding the best hardwood or softwood tree that we wanted to release. The timber stand improvement, which was removing unacceptable growing stock and non-commercial species. We also did some enrichment planting of red spruce. And that's because, as I mentioned earlier, those previous harvests had removed the red spruce seed source from the stand, and there was very little regeneration of that species here. Yet we know historically that it had been prevalent, and it is a desirable long-lived tree for commodity production purposes. We did have some biodiversity considerations in doing this. We wanted to maintain the structure that was here in the stand and the species that were uncommon. So we see here, right behind me, a red pine, which is not a common species in this particular forest. However, we wanted to keep that, and so chose that as one of our crop trees. We also found some northern red oak and some larch, and we hung on to those where they were present. Mostly what we ended up doing pre-commercial thinning on was paper birch. There were some desirable conifers, and where possible, we released those. You often have to make decisions about what tree species to favor, and there are two right here that are worth special consideration for northern conifers. The first on my right is eastern hemlock. The hemlock woolly adelgid is causing widespread defoliation and mortality of eastern hemlock in southern New England and south of that. Here in northern New England, it isn't yet a problem for us, but there is concern about it in the future. We've made the decision here to continue to manage for eastern hemlock, but try to maintain the most vigorous trees possible. Eastern hemlock remains a very important component of this ecosystem, and so there is value in perpetuating it for the future. On my left is northern white cedar. This species has been experiencing range-wide recruitment failures, apparently due to overbrowsing by white-tailed deer. Even though we don't have very high populations of deer here in northern New England, we have observed that here. On the experimental forest, we have seen great reductions in northern white cedar from harvesting over the years, and little to no recruitment of this species. Research throughout the region suggests that if there is high pressure from deer, you will not be successful in regenerating this species. If fencing is not an option, which it often isn't due to expense, the best approach might be to wait until there's an opportunity in the future when deer populations are lower to try to regenerate this. Other approaches have been suggested, such as creating slash walls or using felled tops to deter deer browsing, growing northern white cedar in with other species to try to reduce browsing pressure, and I think these are worth trying, but they're unproven. The bottom line is that if you're managing northern white cedar, it is extremely important to make sure that you have established and released your advanced regeneration before removing your overstory trees. In addition, on lowland sites, layering, in which small seedlings or saplings of cedar are pushed to the ground by snow or branches rest on the ground in root, is a predominant form of regeneration. So consider how your new cedar got there and keep that in mind in management. This isn't a species that you can expect to seed in or to regenerate in great abundance after a harvest. This part of the stand was commercially thinned about 10 years ago, and we can tell that from the trees being much bigger and the crowns have reclosed. I mentioned multiple times the more rapid growth of balsam fir and the tendency to decay. So here, these trees are now ready to be harvested. And as we look around, we see that some of the fir are starting to show butt swelling that comes from moisture being inside them and the decay. And so it's time to think about doing a regeneration treatment. As we consider that, this particular stand has a somewhat irregular structure and composition because it was used for different types of research. Parts of it have been kept quite dense and others have been thinned at different times. So we want to think about a regeneration method that would include perhaps different treatments associated with the different conditions in the stand. I've mentioned a number of times irregular shelterwood, and that is something that we would consider here. That really just refers to a somewhat even-aged approach to management, but one that maintains structural complexity. And we'll show you an example of that later. One of the things that I want to mention is that the thinnings were done here to either 33 or 50% removals, and that would not have been possible if we had not done a pre-commercial thinning. All of these trees have a stable height-diameter ratio and a long crown. Without coming into a stand and having previously reduced the density and allowed that stable tree form to develop, you could not come into it at this stage of development and reduce the density to that degree without experiencing wind throw and other similar problems. So those are factors to consider when you're thinking about managing an even age stand. That initial investment in pre-commercial thinning not only helped us get to the point where we're now able to consider a regeneration treatment in this stand while the unthinned part isn't even ready for a commercial thinning, but it gave us tree structure that is more wind firm and gives us more options for management today. So why do selection cutting? I've talked about defining the target residual structure and the care that needs to be taken in collecting your inventory data and comparing those to what you want to achieve. This approach provides continuous forest cover. So the even age systems that we have looked at have a period of time when there aren't a lot of mature trees on the site. So in special protection areas or those in which aesthetics is a concern, an approach such as this one could be appropriate. In addition, the single tree selection stands have what we call the wall of green. So as we can see, foliage from close to the ground all the way up to the top of the canopy. And this comes from the close interspersion of trees of different sizes and ages amongst each other in the stand. This creates a vertical structure or stratification that has habitat niches at many different levels that could support a variety of forest birds or other species. So when we think about application of the selection system, we want to consider that there are some places where it isn't suitable. So stands that are very dense and have not had past management would have trees with small crowns and unstable height diameter ratios that would not respond well to heavy partial cutting. Similarly, if a stand is a stratified even age stand, it might have a reverse J diameter distribution that results from some species growing more slowly and being smaller than others, rather than having a distribution of age sizes. Research has shown that in stands like that, if you try to apply a reverse J structure, the small trees that you're trying to release might be old and suppressed and will not grow as well as they would if it was truly a stand of multiple ages. One of the ways we can tell if a stand is uneven aged is by looking at the height distribution and the length of the crowns and see if we think that there are trees represented in multiple age classes so that the young trees are young and vigorous and not just old and suppressed. And then the last point I'll make is that managing these stands with a reverse J diameter distribution, particularly one that was derived using a Q factor, can be somewhat complicated and artificial, and that it might not closely represent a natural stand structure. Although there are certainly more similarities between a single tree selection stand in this forest type than the sorts of structures that result from even-aged management, it is somewhat contrived. Another approach, if you wanted to manage an uneven-age stand using a traditional single tree selection approach, but not manage number of trees in every 1 or 2 inch size class, would be to define target residual basal area goals for broad size classes like the poles, small saw timber, and medium to large saw timber, and then shoot for those target residual distributions rather than trying to manipulate trees in such small classes. In doing this, you would still want to consider the distribution of species across the various categories that you're managing and make sure that all your entries improve the quality and vigor of the stand. That's really important to long-term sustainability, both in terms of having good quality trees in the future and making sure that you have small trees to grow into large trees of the same species. So in some forest types, there have been concerns about single tree selection cutting, which creates very small canopy openings, driving species composition towards just a few species. In northern hardwoods, for example, you can end up with a stand almost exclusively sugar maple, and you need to have some groups or larger gaps if you want to bring in some less tolerant species like yellow birch or white ash. Now, it's true that you need to have the larger gaps to really perpetuate those sorts of species in northern conifers as well, but because we have so many shade tolerant species, you can still maintain good species diversity with this approach. So as an example, I'm standing right now by a northern white cedar tree. I mentioned earlier when introducing this forest type that this is quite common. In fact, here in the state of Maine, it's one of the top 5 species, which is often a surprise to folks. The northern white cedar is very slow growing. It can take 100 years for it just to reach pole size under suppressed conditions, but it has the potential to grow well in response to release. And so an approach such as this one in a mixed stand with many different types of shade-tolerant conifers can maintain other species like this one, which has commodity value for shingles and specialty products and is an important source of habitat for white-tailed deer. We also do have some hardwoods in these stands. Tends to be red maple, some single stem but mostly sprout, some paper birch, and on better sites, if you have a somewhat larger opening, we will pick up some yellow birch. One of the benefits of having mixed woods is greater resilience, not only to changes in the future in insects and diseases, other forcing agents, but market factors as well. So as an example, here on the Penobscot Experimental Forest, when we began our study in the 1950s, we were trying to manage stands so that they would generate the most products for the pulp and paper industry, because that was the biggest thing going on in forest products industry at that time. Since then, there has been a big shift. We have seen in recent years a movement away from softwood pulp toward hardwood pulp and other products. And so the stands that we have managed exclusively to produce softwood pulp now are less valuable from those that are more diversified. So there's a lot of reasons, both biodiversity, ecological, and economic, to consider maintaining species mixtures whenever possible. In selection stands, where we're coming in and tending on a very frequent basis, we also are likely to remove trees that have quality issues or the potential to die and become snags. When we're thinking about forest management in a contemporary sense, we want to make sure that we retain trees that have potential wildlife value even though that differs somewhat from the textbook recommendations for how you would do selection. That would be some trees that are larger than your target maximum diameter, some trees that have decay and could be used as cavities or could be recruited as snags. In all of your entries, you want to be thoughtful about skid trail layout. We have found that designating and reusing trails and really asking for careful felling, directional felling, use of appropriate machinery and operations is important. Because one of the benefits of the selection system or any type of uneven age management is that you're growing large, high-value sawtimber trees. So if you have residual stand damage from multiple entries, you are jeopardizing the long-term goal with regard to commodity production. So being thoughtful about establishing your trails and being thoughtful how you extract wood from the forest can be a really important part of the application of this treatment. The stand that we're in now has been managed with single tree selection cutting for 70 years. Here on the Penobscot Experimental Forest, we have 4 different cutting cycles that we use for selection cutting, which is of course the silvicultural treatment that creates and maintains uneven age stands. So we have re-entries on 5, 10, 15, and 20-year cutting cycles. This particular stand has been harvested every 10 years with a total of 6 cuts since the experiment began. It was last harvested 1 year ago. So the approach that we're using is the BDQ, or target residual basal area, maximum diameter, and Q factor approach to prescribing a residual stand structure. The Q factor is the mathematical approach to determining the shape of the reverse J, as opposed to the empirical approach, such as the arbogast structure sometimes used for northern hardwoods. So here, the steepness of the reverse J, or the Q that was chosen, was based on the approximate size distribution of trees that the researchers observed when they started in the 1950s. Because there isn't often good guidance on how to determine that mathematical structure. So we have a reverse J, a maximum diameter, which has changed somewhat over time, but for this stand, I think is between 18 to 20 inches at this time. And we come out, inventory the stand, compare the distribution of trees that we have in terms of number of trees per acre in diameter class to the target that we determined ahead of time. And then we remove trees from the size classes that are in excess relative to that goal. That harvest is constrained by the residual basal area goal, which we have determined. Here it is between 90 and 100 square feet per acre. So we're carrying quite high basal area. Each harvest tends to be quite light, with only a 10-year cycle and a residual stocking goal that is that high. We're taking out less than 10 cords per acre. So this normally wouldn't be operational on its own, but can be combined with other harvests. A longer cutting cycle, 15, or we also have 20 years, does remove a greater proportion of the stand at once and is more commercially operable. One of the things that we found in this forest type, dominated by shade-tolerant conifers, is that the single tree selection system works fairly well for maintaining a vigorous stand with a wide distribution of tree sizes. In some other forest types, for example, northern hardwoods, where you have a preponderance of beech with the beech bark disease, that single tree approach can shift the species composition towards that very tolerant beech to the detriment of other species you might want, like sugar maple. Here that isn't so much of a concern. We have found, however, that this approach really encourages eastern hemlock, which is an important component of this forest type. From a commodity production potential, eastern hemlock isn't as desirable in this region as the red spruce would be, or the eastern white pine, which we see a nice example of here. Very light partial harvests allows the buildup of advanced regeneration in the understory, and it is released with subsequent entries. We've already talked about the fact that the spruce just isn't as competitive and has narrower regeneration requirements. So we found over time, even though this approach maintained a wide distribution of tree sizes, that we had to think carefully about species composition. When they first started the study out here, they just had one single reverse J structure, and they had species priorities that motivated them to cut fir more heavily than, for instance, red spruce. And that makes sense when we think about the pathological longevity of the fir and the fact that it is the preferred host of the spruce budworm and doesn't ultimately have the product potential as the red spruce or the white pine, which you can go really large saw timber from. Unfortunately, we weren't thinking about the distribution of these different species across the size classes that we had. So what was happening is we were building up a lot of fir in the smaller size classes, and we were maintaining our spruce in the really large saw timber classes, but we weren't recruiting the spruce at the rate that we needed to maintain it in those larger classes. So because of that, we've shifted our approach. So now we have different target structures for different species groups. So I have a target diameter distribution for spruce and hemlock that includes trees to a very large maximum diameter, and I have a different one for fir, which has a smaller maximum diameter. And in managing the stand that way, I'm able to determine not only whether the structure is sustainable, but whether the species are sustainable as well. We found that in addition to thinking about the individual species dynamics, that we had to start doing some tending of the submerchantable classes to move those red spruce along. Now this can vary with species composition, but here we're on the very southern edge of the Acadian forest, and we have a much larger component of hemlock than we do farther north. At very low light levels, less than 15% canopy opening, the eastern hemlock grows more rapidly than either the fir or the spruce. At light levels above that, the fir has a competitive advantage. So within these uneven age stands with this particular species mixture, there is no light level at which you can favor the growth of spruce over its two most common conifer companions. For that reason, we started to come through after our selection cut and do a little pre-commercial work with brush saws, not a spacing, but selectively finding the best potential red spruce crop trees in the submerchantable classes and releasing them. And that seems to be helping with recruitment. In addition, there has been some work from Quebec that has suggested that going to a hybrid single tree in group selection approach, not where you lay out gaps of a particular large size for a percentage of the stand, but create some small openings that consist of more than one or two trees, where maybe you have mature trees that are ready to come out or well-established advanced regeneration, might be favorable to better release trees in the submerchantable classes and make sure that they're recruiting at a fast enough rate. Carrying too much basal area in the overstory can suppress the growth of the new stand underneath. So here we have to balance maximizing the growth of the commercial trees with making sure that we're regenerating and recruiting regeneration at an acceptable rate. The other thing that I want to mention, and this is related to the different species that you have, because the fir have a maximum diameter that is in the pole size classes, we had to be thoughtful about not overcutting those classes relative to our reverse J goal. All of things like this are accomplished through development of our target residual, comparison to what we have, and the determining a marking guide. That marking guide helps us to know what sizes we want to remove trees from and which species we want to prioritize. In addition, we use marking goals that prioritize first the removal of unacceptable growing stock and cull trees, non-commercial species if we need to do some timber stand improvement, and then we continue to work on improving the spacing in the stand, the thinning, the quality. Every single entry that we do has the objective of improving the stand. This means that the first entries might not be as profitable as later entries as you condition a stand that has not been previously managed. part of the stand was commercially thinned about 10 years ago, and we can tell that from the trees being much bigger and the crowns have reclosed. I mentioned multiple times the more rapid growth of balsam fir and the tendency to decay. So here, these trees are now ready to be harvested. And as we look around, we see that some of the fir are starting to show butt swelling that comes from moisture being inside them and the decay. And so it's time to think about doing a regeneration treatment. As we consider that, this particular stand has a somewhat irregular structure and composition because it was used for different types of research. Parts of it have been kept quite dense and others have been thinned at different times. So we want to think about a regeneration method that would include perhaps different treatments associated with the different conditions in the stand. I've mentioned a number of times irregular shelterwood, and that is something that we would consider here. That really just refers to a somewhat even-aged approach to management, but one that maintains structural complexity. And we'll show you an example of that later. One of the things that I want to mention is that the thinnings were done here to either 33 or 50% removals, and that would not have been possible if we had not done a pre-commercial thinning. All of these trees have a stable height diameter ratio and a long crown. Without coming into a stand and having previously reduced the density and allowed that stable tree form to develop, you could not come into it at this stage of development and reduce the density to that degree without experiencing wind throw and other similar problems. So those are factors to consider when you're thinking about managing an even age stand. That initial investment in pre-commercial thinning not only helped us get to the point where we're now able to consider a regeneration treatment in this stand while the unthinned part isn't even ready for a commercial thinning, but it gave us tree structure that is more wind firm and gives us more options for management today. So I want to point out what we've seen happening here with this fir. So the fir have broken off, and you can see inside that there was heart rot. This is what I was referring to when I said that fir has a short pathological longevity, particularly on these poor quality sites. They're very prone to decay, and often by the time they're 60 to 80 years, or by the pole or sometimes small saw timber class, you tend to have the fir break up like this. And in stands where you have large areas of fir, you can have a whole patch in a stand start to experience mortality at the same time. One of the things that we have to consider with both pre-commercial and commercial thinning is that we are accelerating the growth of the fir to a size where they tend to be more vulnerable to decay. And so considering when you'll come back for your commercial thinning is important if you put the investment into pre-commercial thinning your fir. So this is one of the red spruce that we planted here in the stand where we had removed the mature spruce and the seed source in past harvest and wanted to bring that back as a component. These were 2.0 container stock planted about 10 years ago. They were heavily browsed by small rodents and hair. The ones that were protected within, we had used yellow cages, started to outgrow those, and we removed the cages, and unfortunately they were then subjected to more browsing. This particular seedling, which is probably no taller than it was when we planted it, is almost been crushed by some of the stems that died from a red maple sprout clump, which you can see here on my right, which had been killed with the basil spray. I think the intention at the time was to use the growing space that had been made available by planting a spruce here. And the fact that this dead wood is near it, I think actually isn't completely bad, because I would suspect to some degree that this provided some protection from browsing relative to the ones that were right out in the open. If we look at another example, here we see a second red spruce that was planted. Again, has been heavily browsed. And in this case, a balsam fir, which was adjacent to it, was released by our treatment and has grown much more rapidly over the past decade. And so here we see the competitive advantage of fir relative to the red spruce. So I don't think that this was a bad idea, but I think that perhaps being more thoughtful about our protection from browsing and the potential for understory competition would have helped it to be more successful. In fact, when I think about the understory response to the treatment, we know by definition that thinning treatments, the pre-commercial thinning that we did, are meant to redistribute growing space and improve the growth of the trees you already have on the site, not to establish new regeneration. But in stands where you have a preponderance of shade-tolerant species, not only are existing advanced regeneration released during the thinning, but you can have new regeneration established. We also had a really big flush of understory vegetation in this stand, which in some ways presents competition, but in other ways increase the wildlife habitat values here. All of these things have increased the diversity and the structural complexity of the stand, and I think are in service of our long-term goal, which is after a commercial thinning, start to think about a future irregular shelterwood treatment in this stand. The structural and compositional complexity would be well suited for an approach where you use perhaps some areas with gaps and some areas with thinning, and that's something that we'll look at here on the forest later today. So the stand that we're in right now is part of a long-term study we have here on the Penobscot Experimental Forest that includes strip cuts 1, 2, and 3 chains wide. This was originally put in the 1960s, and at that time was a study of slash disposal methods. One of the interesting things that we sometimes encounter in research is that the question that was asked for an original study might no longer be as relevant as it once was, but there might be new questions that can be answered. This is a really nice example of that. So because they used stem-only harvest, whole tree harvest, and stem-only harvest with burn in the original study, this now provides an opportunity for us to look at different outcomes from biomass harvesting in a comparison of the whole tree removal or the stem-only removal, as well as the effects of prescribed burning, which can be used for fuels management. So the treatment here was a strip clear cut. After the first 50 years, we came in and we compared species composition, structure, and soil and foliar nutrients. What we found is no difference in soil and foliar nutrients between the whole tree harvested, stem-only harvested, or stem-only harvested and burned sites. That was really important because there have been concerns about whole tree harvesting with regard to deterioration of site quality. And even on a poor site, such as the one we have here, we didn't see that happen. We did, however, see some differences in species composition that were associated with these different harvesting operations. In general, in the northern conifer forest type, where we have shade-tolerant conifers relying on advanced regeneration, a true clear cut will not maintain those species in the stand. So in this region, we define a silvicultural clear cut as the removal of all trees from the site for the purpose of establishing a new stand after the fact. So a stand that has established advanced regeneration in which you remove all the large trees, we would call that an overstory removal. So here, where we've done a true clear cut, so no established advanced regeneration, the stand that came back in the 1960s had many more hardwoods than the stand that had been here previously. So when we came back 50 years later, we found some component of spruce and fir, but a lot of aspen, birch, and red maple. We also found that where we had done the whole tree harvesting, we had a greater proportion of white pine than we did elsewhere in the stand. Even though it wasn't an abundant species, we think that the greater scarification that resulted from the whole tree operation created favorable microsites for that species. In addition, where the prescribed burn had been done, we found a greater proportion of hardwoods than in the others. And that we think is because the few advanced regeneration trees that had been there, or the balsam fir or spruce that regenerated in the first year, had been killed by the burn. And this pushed the stand even further to hardwoods. So clear cutting alone will convert a shade-tolerant softwood stand to hardwoods in this forest type. Adding burning to that only exacerbated that change. So I now want to move over to an area where we did the prescribed burn and see what that looks like. Here we have behind me an area that was not burned, and we see 8 to 10 foot tall aspen regeneration quite dense in this stand. I think the aspen sprouted particularly vigorously because the ones that were here were only about 50 years old when we came in a couple years ago and repeated the original harvest. When we go to the other side of the road, we'll see where the aspen started, but then we did a fall burn the year after the second cut, and it really knocked back that hardwood component. The portion of the stand that I'm in right now is part that was burned. So again, we repeated the strip clear cuts, removing all trees larger than 1 inch at breast height in 2018. So that was the original treatment, only done again. We also repeated the burn the following fall. So that was a late season prescribed burn. It was a broadcast burn done in collaboration with the Maine Forest Service. And what we see here is we had mortality of the aspen throughout the burned site. The red maple sprouts have been coming back, but we have primarily herbaceous vegetation here. So if you're interested in maintaining the long-lived shade-tolerant softwoods, strip clear cutting of this size would not be suitable for that. Furthermore, adding burning to that maintained, here at least, for the timing and intensity of burn we did, a more open herbaceous and shrub understory. And so if you wanted to manage these forests for that sort of early successional shade intolerant condition, this approach would be successful for that. We'll find out as we go forward whether the second whole tree harvest had any greater impact on site productivity than the first one, but so far we haven't determined any damaging effects to the site. So I just want to end our visit to the strip clear cut by mentioning briefly what the difference would be between this approach and a strip shelterwood. Strip shelterwood is sometimes practiced in northern conifers, and there the strips are much narrower, perhaps no more than 1 tree height wide. And that means that the trees growing in the strip are not only close to the source of seed for regeneration, but in a shaded microenvironment. Here, these strips at 1 to 3 chains wide and much longer than that mean that the trees in the middle of these openings are growing in an open environment. And so then we're favoring the less shade tolerant species and not the shade tolerant conifers. So that's the difference between these two approaches. They both use strips, but the width and orientation of these strips and the sylvics of the species we're managing mean that a different compositional outcome will occur.